Stale beer mixed with cheap cologne used to soundtrack my ruin. In my first life, I drove through a flash flood to drag my drunk fiancé out of a gutter, only to die a miserable broken woman a decade later. But when my eyes snapped open to my cell phone's abrasive blare, I didn't reach for my keys. I stared at stained popcorn stucco, swallowed a phantom taste of my own blood, and hung up. Tonight, I wasn't saving him. Tonight, I was marrying a dead man, walking. The mattress springs dug into my lower back, sharp and familiar. I didn't open my eyes immediately. I was too busy waiting for the pain. The crushing, suffocating weight of the steering column collapsing into my chest. The shatter of windshield glass raining down on my cheeks. The distinct coppery taste of blood pooling in the back of my throat. I waited for the sirens, for the blinding red and blue lights flashing against the relentless sheet of rain. But there was only a low, rhythmic hum, a refrigerator compressor kicking into gear. I blinked. The ceiling above me wasn't the crumpled roof of a sedan. It was popcorn stucco, stained with a sprawling yellow watermark shaped vaguely like a bruised lung. My lungs. I took a breath. It was deep, unobstructed, and smelled faintly of dust-cheap vanilla wax and old laundry detergent. No blood, no gasoline. Next to my head, the phone vibrated, an angry, buzzing insect on the cheap particle board nightstand. The screen lit up the cramped bedroom with a harsh blue glare. Liam, the name, felt like a physical strike. I stared at the block letters, my mind swimming through a thick sludge of adrenaline and disbelief. The digital clock next to the phone blinked back in red LED slashes, 11:42 p.m., October 14th. 10 years ago, it was the night my life pivoted from merely disappointing to an absolute inescapable hell. In my past life, or whatever the hell you wanted to call the 34 years of misery I had just finished enduring, I answered that call. Liam was drunk at a dive bar downtown. He had lost his keys, spent our rent money on tequila shots for girls who wouldn't look at him twice in the daylight, and needed a ride. I had thrown on a ratty hoodie, grabbed my keys, and driven out into the worst autumn storm the city had seen in a century. I had hydroplaned on the interstate. The car flipped. I survived, but my spine didn't. I spent the next decade in a wheelchair, bound to a man who resented me for the burden I became trapped in a tiny apartment, slowly wasting away from infections and neglect. I died in an underfunded state ward, staring at a ceiling alone. The phone buzzed again, vibrating closer to the edge of the nightstand. It teetered, threatening to fall. I reached out. My hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the raw, vibrating energy of being whole. My fingers were slender, unscarred. My knuckles weren't swollen from years of gripping wheelchair rims. I picked up the heavy plastic device. It felt ancient. I pressed the green button. I didn't say a word. "Chloe, come on, babe. Don't be a bitch." Liam's voice slurred through the tiny speaker, accompanied by the muffled, throbbing bass of a jukebox and the clinking of cheap glassware. "I need a ride. At the Rusty Anchor. Lost my wallet. Need you to pay the tab, too. Bring cash." A beat of silence passed. He hiccuped. "Chloe, you listening? Don't make me wait. It's raining." The sheer staggering entitlement of it hit me like a splash of cold water. 10 years of guilt, 10 years of apologizing for an accident that happened because I was trying to save him from his own pathetic decisions, evaporated in a single second. I didn't feel anger. Anger was too hot, too passionate. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. "Call a cab, Liam," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It wasn't the weak, raspy croak of a dying woman. It was steady, flat. "I told you, I ain't got my wallet." He barked a flash of the nasty temper I used to tiptoe around. "Get your ass down here. Now." I pressed the red button. The line went dead. I dropped the phone back onto the nightstand and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My bare feet hit the cheap laminate floor. It was freezing. God, it felt amazing. I curled my toes, savoring the rough texture of the grit and dust against my skin. I walked to the window. Outside, the rain was coming down in thick, violent sheets, turning the streetlights into blurry, bleeding halos. The gutters were overflowing, spilling muddy water onto the sidewalks. It was exactly as I remembered it. If I stayed here, Liam would eventually stumble home, soaking wet, screaming, and breaking things. He would demand an apology. I would eventually cave. The cycle would continue. The crash hadn't just broken my body in that other timeline. It had locked me in a cage of codependency. I needed to leave. Not just the apartment, but the entire trajectory of my existence. I pulled open the top drawer of my dresser and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag. A couple of jeans, some plain t-shirts, my one good wool sweater. My hands moved with a mechanical precision. Where was I going? I didn't have savings. I had $50 in a jar in the kitchen and a checking account that was currently overdrawn by $12 because Liam had bought a new gaming headset. I zipped the bag shut. The metal teeth caught biting into the fabric, and I yanked it free. As I stood in the dim light of the bedroom, a memory surfaced. It wasn't a memory from before the crash, but a memory from the hospital. In my previous life, I had spent 6 months in the orthopedic trauma wing of St. Jude's. The nurses there gossiped incessantly. It was the only entertainment I had. And the biggest story of the decade happened exactly on October 14th in the VIP intensive care unit, 3 floors above where I had been lying in traction. Amos Hayes, the heir to the Hayes shipping empire, a man worth roughly $4 billion in liquid assets alone. He had been in a coma for 3 months following a suspicious boating accident. Tonight, October 14th, at exactly 2 a.m., the Hayes corporate board was set to hold an emergency vote to strip his side of the family of their shares, citing Amos's incapacitation and lack of a legal heir or spouse to act as his proxy. His grandmother, Beatrice Hayes, a woman known for wearing pearls and destroying lives before breakfast, was desperate. According to Nurse Brenda's whispers, Beatrice had scrambled to find a proxy wife for Amos that very night. She ended up paying a minor socialite millions to sign a marriage certificate. The socialite took the money sold out to the rival faction 6 months later, and Amos's life support was quietly pulled by the hostile board members. He died without ever opening his eyes. I looked at the clock, 12:15 a.m. I grabbed my heavy raincoat. The yellow vinyl was stiff and squeaked as I pushed my arms through the sleeves. I didn't care. I shoved my feet into a pair of worn-out combat boots and grabbed the $50 from the kitchen jar. I wasn't a socialite. I was a nobody with a bruised ego and a second chance. And Beatrice Hayes was a desperate woman with a checkbook. I stepped out of the apartment, locking the deadbolt behind me, and walked into the rain. The bus ride to St. Jude's took 20 minutes. I sat in the very back, shivering in my damp clothes. The heater near my feet blew out air that smelled faintly of diesel and burnt hair. Water dripped from the hem of my yellow raincoat, forming a small, dirty puddle on the grooved rubber floor. I watched the city blur past the window. My mind was eerily quiet. There was no panic, no frantic questioning of how I had traveled back in time. The reality of the grease on the bus window, the squeak of the brakes, the damp chill seeping into my socks. It was all too tangible to be a hallucination. I had died. Now I was alive. I didn't need to understand the physics of it. I just needed to survive it. The hospital doors slid open with a soft, hydraulic hiss. The lobby was painfully bright, illuminated by rows of aggressive, fluorescent tubes that made everyone look slightly jaundiced. The air hit me immediately, a clinical cocktail of rubbing alcohol floor wax and the subtle metallic tang of sickness. I didn't stop at the front desk. I knew the layout of St. Jude's better than my own apartment. I bypassed the elevators in the main lobby, which required key cards for the upper floors, and headed for the stairwell near the cafeteria. 7 flights of stairs. By the 4th floor, my thighs were burning. By the 6th, I was panting my breath, echoing harshly in the concrete chamber. But I felt the burn. I reveled in the sharp, lactic ache in my muscles. I hadn't felt my legs in 10 years. The pain was exquisite. I pushed through the heavy fire door on the 7th floor, the VIP wing. The difference was staggering. The linoleum turned into thick, sound-dampening carpet. The harsh lighting shifted to warm, recessed bulbs. The walls were painted a soothing, muted sage instead of institutional white. Down the hall, standing outside room 701, were 3 people. Even from a distance, they radiated a tense, frantic energy. A man in a sharp charcoal suit was pacing, running a hand over his balding head. Next to him stood a younger associate holding a leather briefcase against his chest, like a shield. And then there was Beatrice Hayes. She was smaller than I imagined. Frail, almost wrapped in a heavy cashmere shawl, despite the building's central heating. But her posture was rigid, her spine a steel rod. She was leaning heavily on a silver-tipped cane, watching the pacing man with eyes that could freeze boiling water. "It is unacceptable, Finch." Her voice carried down the quiet hallway, sharp and brittle. "You told me we had a candidate. Where is she?" Sigh, traffic Mrs. Hayes. Finch, the pacing lawyer, stammered. He was sweating. I could smell his panic from 20 feet away. "The storm is flooding the lower avenues. Miss Kensington's driver says they are stuck on 4th. They won't make it before 2 a.m. The board meeting starts in 40 minutes. Then find someone else." Beatrice hissed her knuckles, turning white on the handle of her cane. "If Amos does not have a proxy with power of attorney, by the time that gavel falls, my brother-in-law will take the company, and he will pull the plug on my grandson by sunrise. I don't care if you have to marry him to a scullery maid. Find someone with a pulse and a signature." I unzipped my raincoat, letting it fall open, so I looked slightly less like a drowned rat, and stepped forward. My wet boots squelched loudly on the expensive carpet. All 3 heads snapped toward me. "Security is on the 1st floor." The younger associate barked, stepping in front of Beatrice defensively. "You can't be up here." I ignored him. I kept my eyes locked on Beatrice. I walked until I was close enough to smell her perfume, something floral, and obscenely expensive, layered over the faint, undeniable scent of old age and fear. "Miss Kensington isn't going to make it," I said, keeping my voice low and level. "And even if she does, she's sleeping with your nephew. She's going to vote with the hostile faction the second she gets the ring on her finger. The silence in the hallway was absolute. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic hum of a heart monitor from inside, room 701. And Finch stopped sweating and went deathly pale. "Who are you? How do you know that?" "It doesn't matter who I am," I said. I looked at Beatrice. She was scrutinizing me, her dark eyes tracking the water dripping from my hair, the cheap denim of my jeans, the absolute lack of deference in my posture. "What matters is that it's 1:10 a.m. You need a wife for Amos, a legal wall between his life support and your brother-in-law. You are eavesdropping," Beatrice said coldly. "I'm applying for a job," I countered. "I have no ties to your family. I don't care about your corporate politics, and I don't care about the shipping lanes in the Pacific. I want a contract, a monthly stipend, full medical, and a buyout clause if he dies, or if he wakes up and wants a divorce." "This is absurd," Finch sputtered, waving his hands. "Mrs. Hayes, she's a vagrant. I'll call security." "Shut up, Finch," Beatrice snapped, never breaking eye contact with me. She leaned a fraction of an inch closer. "You look like you crawled out of a storm drain, girl. What makes you think I would bind my grandson's legacy to a street rat?" "Because the street rat is standing right in front of you, and she isn't secretly working for the man trying to murder him," I said. My voice didn't waver. I wasn't intimidated by her wealth. When you've laid in a bed for days, begging a nurse to turn you so you don't get pressure, ulcers, money loses its mystique. Desperation is the great equalizer. Right now, Beatrice Hayes was poorer than I was. I held out my hand. It was steady. "I'll sign the prenup, Finch, can notarize it here, and you can walk into that boardroom at 2 a.m. and shove the marriage certificate down your brother-in-law's throat. Or you can wait for a socialite who is currently sexting the enemy in the back of a stuck limousine. Your call." Beatrice stared at my outstretched hand. The seconds ticked by, heavy and suffocating. Then a slow, grim smile stretched across her wrinkled face. It didn't reach her eyes. "Finch," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Draft the standard proxy addendum. Put her name on it. But Mrs. Hayes, do it, or you're fired," she commanded. She looked back at me. "What is your name?" "Girl, Sophia," I said. "Well, Sophia," Beatrice said, turning toward the door of room 701. "Let's go meet your husband." The smell of the ICU was entirely different from the rest of the hospital. It was devoid of anything human. It smelled like sterilized plastic ozone from the high-voltage machinery and a chilling, pervasive cold. Room 701 was massive, yet it felt claustrophobic. It was dominated by machines. Towers of monitors flashed green and blue numbers, plotting jagged graphs that tracked the fragile tether between life and death. IV bags hung like strange clear fruit from metal branches, feeding clear fluids and milky nutrients into a labyrinth of tubing. At the center of it all lay Amos Hayes. I walked closer to the bed, my wet boots silent on the smooth linoleum. He didn't look like a billionaire. He didn't look like the ruthless, handsome tycoon that the tabloids had obsessed over before his accident. He looked like a corpse, waiting for permission to cool. His skin was a terrifying shade of gray, stretched taut over high cheekbones, and a strong jaw that was currently slack and useless. His eyes were taped shut to prevent the corneas from drying out a brutal practical detail that made my stomach tighten. A thick, corrugated plastic tube was shoved down his throat, taped aggressively to his face. The ventilator hissed and clicked in the corner, forcing his chest to rise and fall in a violent, unnatural rhythm. Hiss, click, rise, fall. He was severely underweight. The hospital gown slipped off one shoulder, revealing skin marred by a constellation of dark purple and yellow bruises from constant needle sticks. 3 months ago, his boat exploded, Beatrice said softly from the doorway. The sharp edge of her voice was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. The doctors say it's severe traumatic brain injury. He is suspended, not deteriorating, but not returning. I stared at his chest. Hiss, click. I felt a sudden bizarre kinship with the man on the bed. We were both broken things. In my past life, I had been the one trapped in a ruined body, staring at a ceiling completely at the mercy of people who found me inconvenient. Now, he was the inconvenience. Finch scurried into the room, snapping his briefcase open on a rolling tray table. He pulled out a thick stack of papers. I've amended the standard non-disclosure and proxy marriage contract, Finch said, out of breath, adjusting his glasses. Miss Sophia, this stipulates that you receive a stipend of $50,000 a month. You are provided housing in a guest wing of the Hayes estate. You have zero claim to the Hayes Empire stock options or liquid assets outside of your stipend. In the event of Amos's passing, you receive a lump sum of $2 million and are quietly ushered out the door. If he wakes up, the marriage is instantly annulled, same payout. You are signing over all proxy voting rights regarding his shares to Mrs. Beatrice Hayes. Finch shoved a heavy Mont Blanc pen toward me. Sign here, and initial the last 4 pages. I didn't hesitate. I didn't read the fine print. $50,000 a month was astronomical. It meant independence. It meant physical therapy if I ever needed it. It meant never having to pick up a ringing phone in a damp apartment ever again. I grabbed the pen. The metal was cool and heavy in my grip. I signed my name. The ink bled slightly into the thick, cream-colored paper. I'm a licensed notary and an ordained officiant for the state. Finch mumbled rapidly, gathering the papers as soon as the pen left the page. By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. God help us all. He stamped the papers. The dull thud echoed in the quiet room. The ring, Beatrice demanded, holding out her hand to the young associate hovering in the hall. He handed her a small velvet box. She passed it to me. Put it on him, she instructed, her voice flat. The board will want photographic proof of consummation of the contract. The ring is the visual we need. I opened the box. Inside rested a thick platinum band. Simple, heavy. I stepped up to the railing of the hospital bed. I reached out and gently took Amos's left hand. The contact sent a jolt up my arm. His hand was freezing. The skin was dry, almost papery, but his fingernails were perfectly manicured, a surreal touch of wealth on a dying body. His fingers were limp heavy, like lead weights. I picked up the ring and slid it over his knuckle. It was slightly too big, likely because he had lost so much weight, but it caught securely at the base of his finger. I didn't let go of his hand immediately. I stood there, holding the cold, slack fingers of my new husband, listening to the machine breathe. For him. Finch snapped a photo with a digital camera. The flash briefly illuminated Amos's gray face. It's done, Beatrice said, turning away her cane, tapping against the floor. Finch file it digitally to the courthouse database, then send the receipt to the board. Let's go bury my brother-in-law. They swept out of the room, leaving me alone in the dim light of the monitors. I looked down at Amos. In the timeline, I knew he died because the woman they hired tonight betrayed him. Now, I was the one holding the contract. I wasn't going to betray him. Not because I was a good person, but because $2 million and a quiet life sounded like heaven compared to the hell I had already lived. I leaned over the bed rail, bringing my face close to his ear. I could smell the faint chemical scent of medical-grade soap on his skin. "I don't love you," I whispered to the unhearing man. "And you don't know me. But I'm going to keep you alive, Amos, and you're going to keep me safe. It's a fair trade." I released his hand, letting it rest gently on the white blanket. I turned and walked out of the ICU, leaving the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator behind me, and stepped into my new life. The first thing that hit me was the weight of the blanket. It was heavy, suffocatingly, so pressing down on my shins and thighs. Panic-blind and feral, clawed up my throat. My eyes snapped open, taking in the unfamiliar, cavernous ceiling etched with intricate crown molding. I couldn't feel my legs. The heaviness was exactly the same as the leaden dead sensation that had haunted me for a decade in that small, state-funded apartment. No, 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 no. I gritted my teeth, squeezing my eyes shut, and sent a desperate, terrified command down my spinal cord. My right big toe twitched. Then my ankle flexed. The friction of high thread count cotton brushed against my bare skin. I let out a breath that sounded like a dry sob, kicking the heavy down comforter off my legs. I sat up, pulling my knees to my chest, and dug my fingernails into my calves, just to feel the sharp, stinging pain of it. I was whole. The accident hadn't happened. I was in a guest suite at the Hayes estate, in an upscale zip code I previously couldn't have afforded to drive through. The room was massive, but it possessed the sterile, unwelcoming chill of a museum display. Everything was upholstered in muted creams and imposing charcoals. The air smelled of lemon oil, dustless vents, and old money. On the mahogany nightstand, my cheap, cracked cell phone vibrated violently. It looked like a piece of trash sitting next to the crystal carafe of water someone had placed there while I slept. The screen read 17 missed calls. Liam. I picked it up. The plastic back was warm from the battery working overtime. Before I could swipe to unlock it, it buzzed again in my hand. I answered, putting the phone to my ear without saying a word. "Where the hell are you?" Liam's voice didn't just sound angry, it sounded unhinged. The slurring was gone, replaced by a jagged, hangover-fueled rage. In the background, I could hear the familiar clatter of our cheap apartment, a cabinet door slamming the squeak of the linoleum floor. "You left me at the bar. Sophia, I had to walk 3 miles in the pouring rain. My phone is ruined. My shoes are soaked. I come home and half your shit is gone. What you throwing a tantrum? Get your ass back here right now. I'm not playing this game today." I listened to the sharp intake of his breath, picturing the exact shade of ugly, mottled red his face turned when he yelled. For 10 years, that voice had commanded my guilt. He had blamed his drinking on the stress of caring for a paralyzed fiancé, and I had swallowed the lie because I was the one who crashed the car. "I'm not coming back, Liam," I said. My voice was eerily calm, bouncing off the high acoustic ceiling of the guest suite. "Bullshit. You have nowhere to go. You don't have a dime. Stop being a dramatic bitch and come fix this. The sink is leaking again. Call a plumber. Sophia. I'm married, Liam." I didn't know why I said it. Maybe I just wanted to hear How absurd it sounded out loud. I got married last night. Have a nice life. I didn't wait for his brain to process the words. I pulled the phone away from my face, popped the plastic back casing off, and pulled the battery out. I slid the tiny SIM card from its slot and snapped the flimsy piece of plastic in half between my thumbnails. I tossed the pieces into the brass wastebasket by the bed. The silence that followed was absolute. I walked into the adjoining bathroom. It was entirely clad in white marble, complete with a sprawling soaking tub and a walk-in shower that could fit 6 people. I stripped off the damp t-shirt I had slept in and stepped under the water. I turned the dial until the water was scalding hot, letting it beat down on my neck and shoulders. I washed away the smell of the hospital, the damp chill of the bus ride, and the lingering phantom scent of stale beer. I stood there until the steam thickened in my lungs and my skin turned a flushed, angry pink. When I finally stepped out and wrapped myself in a towel that felt like a thick, plush cloud, there was a soft knock on the bedroom door. I cracked the door open. A woman in a tailored gray uniform stood in the hallway holding a silver tray with a steaming carafe of coffee, a single bone china cup, and a stack of folded documents. She looked at me with a perfectly blank expression, though her eyes flicked to my wet, uncombed hair for a fraction of a second. "Mrs. Hayes," she said. The title felt like a poorly fitting coat. "Mrs. Beatrice requested I bring you breakfast and your itinerary for the week. Your husband is being transferred to the East Wing Medical Suite at noon." I took the tray. It was surprisingly heavy. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Greta, ma'am." She didn't smile. The staff here knew exactly what I was, a purchased commodity, a legal shield. They wouldn't waste their respect on a stray dog Beatrice brought in from the rain. "Right. Thanks, Greta." I shut the door with my foot. I poured a cup of the coffee. It was dark, rich, and tasted slightly of hazelnut. I walked over to the massive bay window overlooking the estate's sprawling manicured gardens, took a sip, and braced myself for the reality of being Mrs. Amos Hayes. 3 weeks blurred into a monotonous, surreal routine. The Hayes estate operated like a small, highly militarized nation. There were security guards patrolling the perimeter, gardeners manicuring the topiaries at dawn, and a legion of silent staff who kept the marble floors gleaming. I rarely saw Beatrice. She was perpetually locked in the study with Finch and a revolving door of corporate executives waging a brutal proxy war against her brother-in-law to maintain control of the shipping empire. I was just the paperweight holding her legal documents down. With $50,000 deposited into my newly opened private bank account on the first of the month, I found myself adrift. I bought new clothes, not designer, just soft, high-quality basics that didn't itch or pinch. I bought good boots. I walked the grounds for hours, simply because my legs worked, relishing the crunch of gravel and the bite of the crisp autumn air in my lungs. But mostly, I spent my time in the East Wing. Beatrice had Amos moved from St. Jude's the morning after the wedding, citing security risks. They converted a massive first-floor library into a state-of-the-art ICU. The mahogany bookshelves were now lined with sterile bandages, saline bags, and backup generators. I didn't go there out of a sense of spousal duty. I went because it was the only room in the house where nobody looked at me with veiled contempt. Amos couldn't judge my cheap roots, and the private nurses were paid far too much to gossip. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol and the faint, dusty scent of old books that the medical scrub couldn't completely erase. Rain lashed against the tall, arched windows, distorting the bare oak trees outside. I sat in an oversized leather wingback chair beside Amos's bed, reading a paperback thriller I'd found in the kitchen. Hiss, click, rise, fall. The ventilator was a constant, rhythmic companion. Over the last 3 weeks, I had learned the sounds of his machinery. I knew the high-pitched chirp meant a feeding tube bag was empty, and the low, droning hum was the pressure mattress inflating and deflating to prevent bed sores. A nurse named David, a burly, soft-spoken guy in blue scrubs, was finishing his shift. He was gently stretching Amos's arms, rotating the joints to prevent the muscles from atrophying and locking into place. "He's running a slight fever today," David noted carefully, laying Amos's left arm back onto a propped pillow. "Nothing alarming. The doctor adjusted his antibiotics. You can sit closer if you want Mrs. Hayes. He won't bite." I marked my page and set the book down. "I'm fine here, David. Talk to him sometimes." David suggested checking the IV line one last time. "Hearing is the last sense to go and the first to come back. You never know what's penetrating the static." David packed up his chart and left the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. I looked at my husband. The grayish pallor of the hospital had faded slightly, replaced by a sickly, translucent paleness. His dark hair had grown out a bit, curling softly around his ears. Without the harsh, fluorescent lights of St. Jude's, he looked less like a corpse and more like a man trapped underwater. I pulled my chair closer. The rubber wheels squeaked against the hardwood floor. I didn't have anything to say to him. I couldn't talk about my day. My day consisted of eating pastries and walking in circles. I couldn't talk about our future. Our future ended the second he either woke up or his heart stopped. I reached out and picked up a bottle of unscented medical lotion from the bedside table. David had left it out. I pumped a dollop onto my palms, rubbed them together to warm it up, and reached for Amos's left hand. I traced the heavy platinum band I had shoved onto his finger weeks ago. I worked the lotion into his knuckles, massaging the stiff, unyielding skin. His hand was a dead weight in mine, limp and heavy. "I bought a cashmere sweater today." I murmured the sound of my voice, strange over the mechanical hiss of the room. "It cost $800. I used to feed myself and Liam for a month on $300. It feels obscene, but it's really soft." I moved my thumbs over his palm, working the lotion into the creases. "Your grandmother is ruthless, by the way. She fired a maid yesterday because the girl dropped a fork in the dining room, and it echoed too loudly. You come from a terrifying gene pool, Amos." I kept massaging, leaning my elbows on the edge of the mattress. The rhythmic motion was hypnotic. Suddenly, the heart monitor on the rolling cart to my right gave a sharp, erratic beep, beep, beep. I froze. The jagged green line on the screen spiked, turning into a frantic scribble, before settling back into its slow, steady rhythm. I looked down at his hand. Beneath my fingers, the muscles in his forearm pulled tight. It wasn't a large movement. It was microscopic, but I felt it. The unmistakable rigid tension of tendons snapping to attention. Then his index finger curled inward, dragging against my palm. It wasn't a limp gravity-driven shift. It was deliberate. It was a twitch of raw electrical resistance. I stopped breathing. I stared at his face, looking for a flutter of his eyelashes, a shift in his jaw beneath the tape of the breathing tube. His face remained perfectly slack, a pale, unmoving mask. I waited for a minute, two. I didn't let go of his hand. "Amos," I whispered. Nothing. The ventilator hissed. The monitor blinked green. The finger remained still. When the night nurse arrived 30 minutes later, I mentioned the monitor spike. She checked the logs on the machine, her face bored. Just an artifact, Mrs. Hayes. A loose lead on his chest, or a phantom muscle spasm. It happens with severe neurological trauma. Bodies are just electrical circuits. Sometimes they misfire. She smiled condescendingly and went to prep his feeding tube. I looked back at Amos's hand, resting on the white sheets. I knew what a dead limb felt like. I had dragged my own useless legs out of bed every morning for 10 years. I knew the difference between gravity, a spasm, and a command from a brain trying to fight its way out of the dark. He was in there. The next morning, the temperature in the house dropped by 10 degrees, and it had nothing to do with the thermostat. I was in the main kitchen, a sprawling expanse of stainless steel and black granite, pouring myself a glass of orange juice. Greta walked in her face, paler than usual. "Ma'am, Mrs. Hayes requests your presence in the conservatory. Immediately." I didn't rush. I finished my juice, set the glass in the sink, and walked through the long, echoing corridors of the manor. The conservatory was a massive, glass-domed room filled with exotic ferns, orchids, and a suffocating, damp heat. Beatrice was seated in a rattan chair, leaning heavily on her cane. She looked exhausted, the skin around her eyes bruised purple with fatigue. Standing opposite her, admiring a violently pink orchid, was a man I hadn't seen before. He was in his late 50s, dressed in a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my entire life's earnings. He had Amos's strong jawline, but where Amos's face was aristocratic, this man's was fleshy and flushed with a lifetime of rich food and expensive scotch. "Ah, the bride," he said, turning as my boots clicked against the terracotta floor tiles. His voice was a rich, oily baritone. Beatrice's knuckles were white on her cane. "Sophia, this is Richard Hayes, my late husband's brother, the brother-in-law, the hostile faction, the man trying to pull Amos's plug." "A pleasure," Richard said, smiling. It was a terrifying smile, full of aggressively white teeth. He didn't offer his hand. He looked me up and down his eyes, snagging on my plain jeans and the oversized cardigan I was wearing. His gaze was a physical weight, peeling back the layers of my current comfort to reveal the cheap, desperate roots beneath. "I must admit, Beatrice," Richard drawled, turning back to the older woman, "when Finch filed the marriage certificate, I expected a gold digger with a bit more polish. This one looks like you found her waiting for a bus." Beatrice didn't flinch. "Her pedigree is irrelevant, Richard. The proxy is legally binding. You do not have the votes to seize the board, and you do not have the medical authority to override his care. Legal bindings are so tedious." Richard sighed, walking slowly toward me. He stopped a few feet away. He smelled heavily of cigar smoke and a spicy, musky cologne that made my eyes water. "You're Sophia, yes. No last name of note, no assets. Finch's background check was quite illuminating. You had $12 to your name the night you married my nephew. 13, actually." I corrected my voice, flat. I didn't step back. Richard chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a fountain pen. He laid the book against his palm and began to write. The scratch of the nib was obnoxiously loud in the quiet, humid room. He tore the slip of paper out and held it out to me. $5 million, Richard said softly. "Tax-free." routed through a shell corporation in the Caymans. Untraceable. I looked at the slip of paper. The zeros trailed off neat and precise. And all I have to do, I asked, sign a simple affidavit. Richard smiled. State that Beatrice coerced you, that you were under duress, chemically altered, or mentally unfit to understand the proxy addendum. The marriage gets annulled by a judge by dinner time. You take the $5 million and disappear. Beatrice loses her voting block. I take my rightful place as CEO, and we let my poor brain-dead nephew finally rest in peace. Richard, Beatrice snarled, halfway out of her chair, her cane trembling. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the check. $5 million. It was more than double what Beatrice was contractually obligated to pay me if Amos died. I could take it walk out the front doors of the estate and vanish. I could buy a house on a beach where it never rained. I'd never have to look at another hospital bed or listen to the morbid hiss of a ventilator again. I reached out and took the check from his fingers. The paper was thick, textured. Richard's smile widened into a smirk. He looked at Beatrice, victorious. See, Bea, everyone has a price. You just bought from the bargain bin. I looked at Richard. I saw, past the suit, in the cologne. I saw the pure, unadulterated rot underneath. If I signed that affidavit, Amos's machines would be turned off tonight. And then, what a man ruthless enough to murder his own nephew for a shipping company wouldn't let a loose end with a $5 million payout just walk away. The moment I stepped off the estate property, I'd probably get hit by a mysterious speeding truck. I knew how fragile a human body was. I knew how easily a spine snapped. I didn't fear Richard Hayes. I had already died once. I held the check between my index fingers and thumbs. With a sharp, deliberate motion, I ripped it in half. Richard's smile vanished. I stacked the halves and ripped them again. I dropped the confetti of expensive paper onto the terracotta floor, right onto the toes of his polished Italian leather shoes. I don't think you understand poverty, Richard. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the humid air like a razor. When you're starving, you don't take the steak from a wolf. The wolf just eats you for dessert. His face flushed, the fleshy cheeks turning a mottled, furious purple. You stupid little... I am legally his next of kin. I interrupted, stepping into his personal space. I was shorter than him, but I tilted my chin up, forcing him to look me in the eye. I hold the proxy. I hold the medical directives. If you come onto this property again, I will have security break your legs and throw you into the street. And if Amos's monitors even blink strangely, if a single nurse looks at me wrong, I won't just sue you. I will drag this family's name through every trashy tabloid on the eastern seaboard until the stock tank's so low you won't be able to afford that cologne. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving. The silence was thick, heavy, with the smell of wet earth and crushed orchids. He didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, nearly tripping over a terracotta pot, and stormed out of the conservatory. The heavy glass doors slammed shut behind him, rattling in their frames. I stood there, my heart hammering a frantic adrenaline-fueled rhythm against my ribs. My hands were shaking. I shoved them deep into the pockets of my cardigan. Behind me, I heard the soft tap of a cane. Beatrice walked up beside me. She looked down at the torn pieces of the check on the floor and then up at me. The cold, assessing look in her eyes had shifted. It wasn't warmth. Beatrice Hayes wasn't capable of warmth, but it was something akin to respect. You turned down $5 million, she noted, her voice raspy. He would have killed me to get it back, I replied bluntly. I prefer the 50 grand a month and a pulse. Beatrice let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. You are a very cynical girl, Sophia. I'm a survivor, Mrs. Hayes. There's a difference. I turned away from her and walked out of the conservatory. I had to go to the East Wing. I suddenly needed to hear the steady mechanical hiss of Amos's lungs to make sure the wolf hadn't gotten to him yet. I didn't trust the nurses anymore. It wasn't a logical suspicion. David, the burly night nurse, had never been anything but meticulously professional, and the daytime staff buzzed around Amos with the frantic, terrified dedication of people who knew their paychecks depended on his pulse. But Richard's visit had poisoned the air in the estate. If a man was willing to hand a stranger a $5 million check to murder his nephew, paying off a nurse with a fraction of that amount to accidentally kink a breathing tube or swap a medication vial would be effortless. So I moved in. I dragged a heavy velvet chaise lounge from the hallway into the East Wing library and pushed it against the wall right beside the towering banks of medical monitors. Beatrice didn't object. She simply watched me from the doorway. That first evening, her face unreadable before ordering Greta to bring me extra blankets. The library smelled different at night. The sterile tang of chlorhexidine wipes faded, replaced by the faint, earthy scent of the leather-bound books lining the walls and the ozone-heavy exhaust of the ventilator. It was 2:14 a.m. The estate was dead quiet. I was lying on the chaise, staring at the ceiling. The rhythmic hiss-click of Amos's breathing machine was the only anchor in the room. I threw off the heavy wool blanket, the heat in the room stifling, and walked over to the bed. I checked the IV lines. I traced the thin, clear plastic tubing from the hanging bags of saline and antibiotics down to the insertion point on the back of his right hand. The tape was secure, no swelling. I looked at his face. The medical tape holding his eyelids shut was beginning to curl at the edges, leaving a sticky yellow residue on his pale skin. It bothered me. It was a crude, undignified way to treat a human being. I went to the rolling metal supply cart, found a bottle of saline eye drops, and a pair of latex gloves. I snapped the gloves on. The rubber snapped sharply against my wrists. I'm taking the tape off Amos. I murmured, my voice sounding gravelly and loud in the quiet room. If David yells at me, I'll just remind him I sign his checks. I leaned over the bed rail. I peeled the tape back with agonizing slowness, making sure not to pull the delicate skin of his eyelids. It gave way with a soft, tearing sound. Beneath the tape, his eyes remained shut, the lashes resting dark and heavy against his cheekbones. I gently pried his left eye open with my thumb and index finger. The sclera was bloodshot, a map of broken red vessels, but the iris was a startling deep slate gray. The pupil was sluggish, but when the dim light from the monitor hit it, it contracted. Just a fraction. A tiny physiological flinch. I squeezed 2 drops of saline into the eye, watched it pool and spill over his lashes, and let the lid fall shut. I repeated the process on the right eye. I know you're in there, I whispered, stripping the latex gloves off and tossing them into the biohazard bin. I know what it feels like, being locked inside a heavy, useless cage while everyone talks around you like you're already dirt. I gripped the cold metal of the bed rail. The memory of my past life pushed against the back of my throat, the smell of the cheap, state-funded mattress, the paralyzing terror of watching a spider crawl across my blanket and not being able to move my legs to brush it away. "It's a terrifying kind of dark," I told him, looking at his slack gray face. "But you have to fight it. If you don't fight it, your uncle is going to turn this machine off, and I'm going to end up in a ditch. So wake up. I need you to wake up." His chest rose. It fell, and then his jaw shifted. It wasn't a twitch. The muscles along his cheek bunched hard and deliberate, grinding against the thick plastic of the endotracheal tube shoved down his throat. His brow furrowed a deep crease, forming between his eyes. A choked, guttural sound vibrated in his throat, instantly drowned out by the harsh blare of the ventilator alarm. High pressure. The monitor flashed red. He was gagging. He was biting down on the tube, his body rejecting the plastic, invading his airway. I slammed my hand onto the call button, holding it down. "David," I yelled, my voice cracking. Amos's eyes flew open. They were wild, unfocused, darting frantically around the dim room. His chest heaved completely out of sync with the machine, fighting the forced air. Panic, raw and animalistic, radiated from him. His left hand, the one wearing the heavy platinum ring, shot up from the mattress. It was a jerky, uncoordinated movement, but it found my wrist. His fingers dug into my skin. His grip was weak, trembling with exhaustion, but it was the most human thing I had felt in a month. He stared at me, his slate gray eyes wide with terror, silently screaming around the plastic tube. "I'm here," I said, putting my other hand over his, anchoring him. "You're alive. Breathe. Just let the machine breathe." The door flew open, and David rushed in his face, tight. Amos Hayes wasn't a ghost anymore. Amos's awakening wasn't a cinematic miracle. It was a brutal, ugly medical emergency. For the next week, the East Wing was a war zone of specialists, neurologists, and respiratory therapists. They pulled the tube the next morning, a violently unpleasant process that left Amos coughing up thick fluid and gasping for air like a drowning man pulled onto a dock. He couldn't speak. His vocal cords were bruised, his throat raw. He couldn't walk. His muscles had atrophied into useless, trembling strings. He spent most of his time staring at the ceiling, heavily medicated, his eyes tracking the frantic movement of the nurses with a dark, simmering confusion. He knew who Beatrice was when she stood at the foot of his bed and wept a dry, terrifying sound I never wanted to hear again. But when he looked at me, there was only a blank, guarded void. I didn't mind. I had kept my end of the bargain. He was breathing on his own. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my past finally caught up with me. I was in the kitchen eating a piece of cold toast when Finch burst through the swinging doors. He looked thoroughly rumpled, holding a tabloid magazine rolled into a tight cylinder. "We have a breach," Finch said, his voice a frantic hiss. "Richard's camp leaked your name to the gutter press. Billionaire's mystery bride. They didn't get a photo of you, but they got your old address." I stopped chewing. The toast turned to ash in my mouth. Before Finch could continue, Greta walked in, clutching the landline receiver to her chest. She looked at me, her face pinched in disgust. "Mrs. Hayes, the front gate security is on the line. There is a man on the perimeter. He is violently intoxicated. He is screaming your name and throwing rocks at the security cameras. He claims he is your fiancé." A cold, familiar dread pooled in my stomach. A phantom ache shot down my spine, a ghost of the paralysis that didn't belong in this timeline. "Liam, call the police." Finch snapped at Greta. Have him arrested for trespassing. No, I said. I swallowed the dry toast. I stood up, wiping the crumbs from my expensive cream-colored cashmere sweater. My hands weren't shaking. I'll handle it. Sophia, be reasonable. The press might be out there. I said I'll handle it. I cut Finch off my voice, dropping an octave. I walked out the front doors of the manor. The cold November air bit into my face, sharp and clean. The driveway was a quarter-mile of crushed, white gravel lined with towering ancient oaks. I walked the entire way, the sound of my heavy leather boots echoing in the quiet afternoon. As I neared the massive wrought iron gates, I heard him. Open the damn gate. She's my girlfriend Sophia. Get your ass out here. He was clinging to the iron bars, like a caged animal. He looked terrible. His hair was greasy, plastered to his forehead with sweat, despite the freezing temperature. He was wearing the same ratty hoodie he had worn the night of the storm, stained with cheap beer and stale cigarette ash. 2 security guards in heavy black coats stood on the other side of the gate, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. When Liam saw me walking down the driveway, he stopped, screaming. He gripped the bars tighter, his knuckles turning white. His eyes swept over me, taking in the tailored jeans, the $800 sweater, the absolute lack of fear in my posture. Sophia, he breathed a sickening, manipulative smile, stretching across his face. Babe, what the hell is this? I saw your name in the paper. I thought it was a joke. You married a vegetable. I stopped 3 feet from the gate, close enough to smell the sour, fermented reek of his breath. He's awake, actually, I said flatly. Liam's smile faltered. He shook the gate, the heavy iron rattling against the stone pillars. You think this is funny? You leave me at a bar, steal my rent money, and run off to play dress-up with some rich corpse. You're pathetic. You're nothing without me. You're a bartender who can't even pay her electric bill. In my past life, that voice had made me shrink. It had made me apologize. It had made me turn the steering wheel into a flooded intersection just to appease him. I looked at him now, really looked at him, and I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. He wasn't a monster. He was just a small, pathetic man who used anger to cover up his own rot. You're right, Liam, I said, my voice calm, carrying easily over the wind. I was pathetic. I let you drain my bank account. I let you scream at me when you drank. And I was going to let you drag me down into a miserable, squalid little life. I stepped closer to the bars. Liam instinctively took a half step back, unnerved by the deadness in my eyes. But I woke up, I said softly. I'm Mrs. Amos Hayes now. And if you ever come near this gate again, if you ever say my name out loud to a reporter, I won't just call the police. I will have Beatrice Hayes's lawyers bury you so deep in litigation, you won't be able to afford the cheap tequila you drink to tolerate yourself. I will ruin you, completely and permanently. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The bluster was gone. He was looking at a stranger. Have a nice walk home, Liam. I turned my back on him. I didn't wait to see if he threw another rock. I didn't listen to his pathetic stammering apologies as he finally realized the ATM was closed forever. I walked back up the long white driveway, the phantom ache in my spine completely gone. When I returned to the house, I didn't go to my guest suite. I went straight to the east wing. The library was quiet. The harsh overhead lights were off, leaving only the soft glow of the reading lamps. David was sitting in the corner, charting on a tablet. Amos was propped up in bed. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes bruised dark purple. The ventilator was gone, replaced by a simple nasal cannula delivering oxygen. The feeding tube had been removed yesterday. He was thin, fragile, but the terrifying gray pallor was gone. He was staring at the doorway when I walked in. I pulled up my leather wingback chair and sat down. My boots squeaked against the floor. We hadn't spoken since he woke up, mostly because he physically couldn't, and partly because I didn't know what to say to the billionaire who bought my life to save his own. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His throat worked a difficult, painful swallow. "Who?" he rasped. His voice sounded like two pieces of rough sandpaper grinding together. It was weak, barely above a whisper, but it commanded the room. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "My name is Sophia," I said. He blinked slowly. He raised his left hand, the one that was shaking, with the effort of fighting gravity. He looked at the heavy platinum band on his ring finger. Then he looked at my left hand, resting on my knee. There was a matching thinner band there. Beatrice had insisted on it. "Wife," he ground out the word, tearing at his bruised vocal cords. His eyes narrowed a flash of sharp, terrifying intelligence, cutting through the heavy medication. "Why?" "Your Uncle Richard tried to take the company," I explained, keeping my voice clinical, devoid of emotion. "He argued you were incapacitated, without an heir or a proxy. Your grandmother needed a legal blockade to stop him from pulling your life support. I needed $50,000 a month and a place to stay." I watched him process the information. There was no outrage, no dramatic gasp, just a cold, calculating stillness. "A transaction," he whispered. "A transaction." I agreed. "Richard offered me $5 million to annul the marriage so he could kill you. I tore the check up. I figured you were a safer bet." A harsh, breathy sound escaped his lips. It took me a second to realize it was a laugh. It sounded painful. "Grandmother. Bargain hunts." He rasped his lips, curving into a very faint, cynical smirk. "She does," I said, a small, genuine smile, tugging at the corner of my own mouth. "She thought I was a street rat. But I'm the rat who kept you breathing." Amos let his head fall back against the pillows. He looked exhausted, the brief conversation draining whatever reserves he had built up that day. But the defensive void in his eyes was gone. He looked at me, really looked at me, seeing the cheap roots beneath the cashmere, the cynical survivor who had guarded his bed. He didn't pull away. Slowly, agonizingly, he slid his left hand across the crisp, white sheets until his knuckles brushed against my knee. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an acknowledgement, a truce between two people who had just barely survived being buried alive. "Sophia," he whispered, testing the shape of the name on his ruined throat. "Get some sleep, Amos," I said quietly, not moving away from his touch. "Your uncle is going to try to ruin us tomorrow. You need your strength." He closed his eyes. His breathing deepened, matching the soft, steady rhythm of the heart monitor. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the heat of his skin seeping through the fabric of my jeans. The storm outside had finally passed. The future was unwritten, dangerous, and tied to a ruthless billionaire who owed me his life. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. Sophia just shattered her toxic past and forged a blood pact with a billionaire who is finally awake, and Amos Hayes is not going to let his uncle's betrayal slide. From a desperate marriage of convenience to a ruthless alliance, the Hayes Empire is about to burn. If you loved watching Sophia drag her ex through the mud and take control of her second chance smash, that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the explosive fallout when Amos takes back his boardroom. What would you have done with that $5 million check? Tell me in the comments.